Hey, everybody. Welcome to Big Blend Radio with Nancy and Lisa. You know, the crazy mother-daughter travel team traveling full-time to document parks and public lands, which is part of our Love Your Parks tour. And of course, we publish Big Blend magazines, including Parks and Travel magazine. You can check that out at nationalparktraveling.com. Today, we're excited to welcome acclaimed author and historian Dr. Megan Kate Nelson, and she is joining us to talk about her latest book. It's called Saving Yellowstone, Exploration and Preservation in Reconstruction America. I mean, it's really cool to think about Yellowstone right now. It's 150 years old, America's first national park, the world's first national park, but getting it to be a national park during the Reconstruction period is pretty cool. So check it out. Go to megankatenelson.com. Of course, get on Amazon, all those places. But welcome to the show, Megan. How are you?
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I'm really great. Thanks.
It's
Cool.
good to have you here.
Yeah.
And, thinking about the reconstruct, I never thought about that with Yellowstone. I met one of these crazy people about the Juan Batista de Anza expedition from Spain that went up the coast of California, and it happened in 1776. Here we were at the time of the beginning of America, and I'm going, this is some crazy stuff. All these 200 people walked on foot. They didn't die. They got up to and founded San Francisco. So I find this synergy with what you're doing with Saving Yellowstone at that same time. I mean, the world was shifting, this country was shifting, and it did shift the world. What happened in the Civil War changed things globally. But tell us why you decided to write this book. And I know you got a Civil War background.
I do. I do.
The history of it, I should say. You were not in the Civil War.
Yeah, not the fighting. I'd be very
You're way too young for that.
Yeah, I'd be very impressed with myself if I were
Yeah,
that
right.
old. But yes, I actually came upon this topic while I was finishing writing The Three-Cornered War. One of the protagonists in that book is John Clark, who is the Surveyor General of New Mexico Territory. And so I was doing research into the history of surveying and surveyors and ran across this 1871 Ferdinand Hayden expedition to Yellowstone. And I had known about the Great Surveys, and I'd actually studied them in an art history class in graduate school.
Wow.
Because the surveys produced such amazing works of especially landscape art. And they really shaped the way that Americans thought about the American West. And so I had heard about him, and I just realized this was probably back in 2018, early 2019. And I said, oh my gosh, okay, so the 150th is coming up of this survey. And then this survey very famously led to the passage of the Yellowstone Act, which is also going to have its 150th. And, for a historian, these anniversaries are really important moments because we start to really reckon with these events or places and why they happened and why they were important in the moment, and then why they are important for us now. And so that was one driving question. And then the other question is something that you were just referencing, Lisa, which is, I was thinking, okay, well, obviously there are a bunch of really great books written on Yellowstone. I've got many of them in this bookshelf right here. And, many great field guides, lots of great nature writing, lots of great histories of conservation, but no one had ever really written about Yellowstone being established in the middle of Reconstruction at this pivotal moment in Reconstruction, actually, kind of right central to the Ulysses S. Grant administration. And I thought, well, what if, I just finished writing or was finishing writing a book that looked at the Civil War from the desert Southwest, which is a very unexpected place.
And
I
it's
thought,
interesting.
Yeah. And I thought, well, what if I wrote a book about Reconstruction from this very unexpected place? Would that change the way we think about Reconstruction as a period of our history? We usually focus on the South and not the West there. And would it change our whole idea of Yellowstone if we thought about it in the context of Reconstruction?
Wow. And you're talking about federal government, right? Which you've got to think, it still was kind of new in a way, if you think about federal government.
Well, reformed in a way.
Yeah, it was kind of, we were still young, you know what I mean? I think we still are a young country, but even now, part of why we do our tour and for parks is looking at, are they getting the funding they are supposed to get? And I think about now, how did they fund this whole idea of a park? And at that time, the country's fixing itself. So it's kind of like even now during COVID, all these, oh, we want to spend this, spend that here, and everybody's getting up in arms. Did that happen at that time frame too, in regards to, hey, let's make this park for all these great reasons, but did the funding add up for it?
Yeah, well, and this was something fascinating too. Ferdinand Hayden, who led this expedition, was kind of a solo surveyor practitioner. And because this was all in the time before the USGS was created. So all of these surveyors, many of them had military backgrounds. Ferdinand Hayden had a medical degree because that was the only real way that you could study the sciences in an advanced sort of way during this period. But he was a geologist, and he took over one of the major surveys of Nebraska territory when it entered the Union in 1867. But basically every year he had to go to Congress and lobby for money. And before this point, they'd given him maybe a couple $1,000s, which wasn't, then that was about a year's salary for him, but it was not enough to take a big team. And so he lobbied them to give him money for this Yellowstone expedition after hearing about these kind of amateurs from Montana entering the basin. And he really wanted to go and figure out what was there and claim it for the American scientific community. And his argument was very persuasive because Congress gave him $40,000, which
huge
was
back then.
Yes,
Wow.
and
It's huge.
enormous. Yeah, it was so much money that he was able to put together this giant team of almost 50 people, and of scientists and assistants and wagon drivers and cooks, and bring along artists, to document everything. And so he was able to do that, and he was able to pay himself an actual salary, which meant that finally he could marry his fiance, to whom he had been engaged for 4 years, and he was just
That's
waiting.
funny.
I know, he was waiting to establish himself.
Yeah.
So, so this was a major moment, and at a time when the federal government, the economy was still sort of in shambles from the Civil War. The South was trying to get back on its feet. There are 4 million people newly emancipated from enslavement, and the federal government's trying to protect them. And they're trying to deal with the West and understand what it meant and how they could develop it and bring it into the nation. And that's really what was driving the money. And, once they actually created Yellowstone, they very famously didn't give it any money for quite a bit of time. And it really wasn't until 1883, when the Northern Pacific Railroad was completed and could bring tourists, that Congress really started to be a little bit more responsible about sending money, sending military protection, and really supporting the world's first national park financially.
It's amazing too, when you think about the trains at that time. You're like, this whole thing, how are we growing as a country? And trains, and from what I've heard, that the trains, if it wasn't for the trains, the artwork wouldn't have been seen either in creating the park, because the art had to be, sent on the trains, like actual paintings to showcase to people back east, like, hello, this is what we have in this country,
Yeah,
so
exactly.
that's a huge part too, with the
Yeah,
railroads.
It was the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in May of 1869.
Wow,
So, it was created in legislation during the Civil War, but it, took a little while for it to get underway. And it was really vital to Hayden's survey. He could not have gotten out there. You guys know, because you've been to Yellowstone, and I'm sure you've been there in multiple seasons, but it really only has a little more than a 4-month visiting window. And that was the same in 1871. You had to get in and out between major snowstorms, because especially then, and still now, it's still pretty dangerous if you get caught in a snowstorm or an ice storm or something on some of those roads. They're really steep, and the cell service is not great. And in 1871, Hayden was really concerned about getting his guys out of there, because if they got snowed in, it was very likely they could die. Because
for sure,
because of exposure. So it was super important that he was able to take a train from Omaha to Ogden, Utah, and start from there. And it shortened his trip's time. He was able to go in and do a pretty complete inventory of Yellowstone in just kind of between mid-July and late August.
Wow, that's pretty good. You got to think about, General Grant too. well, I call him General Grant, Ulysses Grant, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting about his legacy in national parks. So like Kings Canyon National Park, we're actually recording this on the anniversary date of Kings
Ah,
Canyon National Park, which
lovely.
was General Grant. It was the Grant National Park named after him. And of course we have the General Grant tree, the world's living shrine. It's the only monument like that. And so his role in this, it's kind of interesting too. I mean, it seems you got Theodore Roosevelt, his name's everywhere, but Grant seemed to, he's interesting as a, you know, him and Sherman seem to kind of, and Lincoln seem to twirl around a lot together.
Exactly. Yeah. And Grant, you know, we usually just dismiss his presidency as full of corruption and, you know, kind of a non-entity. But in this moment, he did two really interesting things. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus in South Carolina, which meant that all of his troops and civil officials could go and arrest Ku Klux Klan members and keep them in jail until they were tried for conspiracy to undermine the 14th and 15th Amendment rights of Black Southerners. And then he also appointed Ely Parker, who was one of his aides during the Civil War, who very famously wrote out these surrender documents at Appomattox, and appointed him as Commissioner of Indian Affairs, the first Indigenous person to hold any high office in the government, and really listened to Ely Parker about a possible future for Indigenous peoples to gain citizenship. And he had this interesting idea that, yes, the federal government, this is what Parker believes, should remove Native people to reservations and they should be quote unquote civilized. But they should be removed into multiple territories that perhaps then could act as real political territories and then become states, so that Indigenous peoples would have official representation in Congress. And Grant initially thought this was a really good idea. I mean, he wanted peace with Native peoples in this early period of his presidency. But what's very peculiar is, you know, here is this very kind of interesting, uplifting moment where the federal government is working for something higher. They're reaching for kind of a higher ideal. They're providing Yellowstone for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. They are thinking in a kind of different way about possibilities for an Indigenous future. They're protecting Black rights in the South. But really, by 1873, all of that was over. And they kind of abandoned Black Southerners to their fate in the South. And then they also turned to the West and really started to engage in active, very aggressive military campaigns against Native people.
Maybe that period where they were being nice, if you want to put it that way, they were really just gaining information and looking at the odds.
I mean, that's possible. And you have to think, you know, Grant as a president was really most comfortable when he was able to act like a general. You know, so when we think of him as General Grant, I think that's, you know, that's why he was kind of in his element in the fight against white supremacy in the South, because he considered those Southerners to still be in rebellion against the federal government. And so he knew how to act. He knew how to take action in that way. And then he also knew how to act as a military commander, driving US troops against Native people. And he does have this moment, you know, he took a tour of the West in 1868 and talked to a lot of military commanders at garrisons and created a map for himself, because he really wanted to understand, when he got reports in, he wanted to understand where these engagements were, and how he could better deploy US Army forces to meet Native resistance.
Yeah, because how do you command the forces if in a territory you haven't been?
Right.
You know, I mean, how do you really do that?
Yeah. Exactly. It was very difficult if you didn't know what was there. And that was part of the push toward Yellowstone too. It's one of the last unmapped places in the country in 1871. And so they wanted to know what was there, and they wanted to either confirm or upend the rumors that everyone was hearing.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the other part of like the Manifest Destiny with Andrew Jackson and Lewis and Clark going across, and you know, that whole document. And there were other people that did it, but the West, it's not easy. I mean, there's vast, I mean, to this day, it's still vast lands, and everybody was, worried about, the Indians, and of course this, and it was unknown at that time, right? So, and depending on where you were. And so what happened with that in regards to the park? Because, natives were living out there in their land. So it's like, hello, government's coming in and taking this over. Isn't that kind of did they understand, oh, we're trying to protect it, even though it says it's for the people, right?
Right,
Well,
right.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
yes.
which people?
And yeah, exactly. And what is important to remember about the 14th Amendment, which provides citizenship rights to anyone born or naturalized in the United States, there is a parenthetical that says, except Indians untaxed, which means any native person not on the reservation, not paying actual taxes to the federal government, which in this moment is like 98% of native people. So they were not considered citizens. And most white Americans didn't consider them citizens with any land rights that they were bound to respect. And Congress, in the same session that they gave Hayden that $40,000, inserted a rider into an Indian Appropriations Act, which is how they funneled money to Indian agencies across the country. They inserted a rider saying that they weren't going to make any treaties anymore with Native peoples. And that was a major moment. And this is a really overlooked moment, I think, in American history, because that's when the U.S. Indian policy started to shift. So the first move was not going to be treaty making. It was going to be warfare. It was going to be
because if you try treaty, that you're saying that the other side has something valid to say.
Yeah, so you recognize them as a sovereign nation.
Exactly. So you're giving them some credence. So no treaties, no credence, and we can do what we want.
That sucks.
Exactly.
I know.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And so that's the whole context of this whole moment with the preservation of Yellowstone. And then also the kind of pushback that Sitting Bull is giving, not to the Hayden expedition necessarily, although he shaped it in interesting ways, but to the Northern Pacific Railroad project, where Jay Cooke was he was sending surveyors out at the same moment as Hayden, and they were trying to figure out where they could lay down the track between the Missouri River and the Yellowstone, that was Lakota country. It was the heart of their homeland. And this is really where Sitting Bull starts to emerge as a major figure and enters the American imagination. And in the book, I really argue that we should see this period and this contestation of the Yellowstone region as the beginning of the road to the Battle of Little Bighorn.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it goes off to, the Nez Perce and what happened with them and Chief Joseph. I mean, that's a hell of a story too. I mean, he really,
absolutely.
How he rode until he did want to save his people, and it's, and then here we are with one of our national parks. Here's all the presidents on a rock and Crazy Horse. It's like that's a weird, we haven't done that yet. And it's just, I don't know if I want to go. It's just odd. You have to go, but it's very interesting. I'm glad you going on the Reconstruction time, and that you've also focused in your last book on the Civil War in the Southwest, because it's something that people forget about, how much the West things were going on, even in Central California. We covered a lot the Sequoia region. The North and the South were fighting there with gunshots in the streets back then. It carried on, and the Southwest. I don't know if you've been to northern New Mexico and that area where a lot of that was going on. Our Park Service does document that, and it's forgotten the Apache wars down and I mean, it's crazy, but it's all connected in a way, right?
And are you guys planning to go to Yellowstone during this 150th anniversary?
We are hoping to do that this summer, actually, maybe fall even. Yeah, we're going across. We're in Washington State now, then heading your side of the country to Maryland and Connecticut and all of that. So we'll probably have to do a detour, but it's interesting for people to read and before they go almost and have that full experience. So when you go there, like how many people it affected.
Yes. Yeah. And that's what I'm hoping this book will do. It'll give people context to sort of understand Yellowstone in the fullness of its history. And I think you can still enjoy Yellowstone. You can still go and wonder at it while knowing all of this history. And the reason that I asked if you were going is because the Park Service is actually engaging a lot with Indigenous history in Yellowstone this year and moving forward. But they're taking this anniversary moment as a kind of propulsive moment to establish a lot of connections and dialogues with more than 20 Indigenous nations that have a relationship with Yellowstone. They're also building a Native History Center that they're putting at Old Faithful, which is the most visited site. So that's fantastic. And then they're also doing an installation of a Crow village at the northern entrance.
Oh,
so yeah. So, and I think this is great. You know, Cam Shawley announced this a couple of months ago, that this would be the initiative and this is how they would celebrate. And this again is why anniversaries are so important, because they do move us toward this kind of reckoning and a revising of what we've always known about a place or an event.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking back in history. None of us here today caused what happened back then, but we sure at least could come forward with the truth and to recognize different things that happened that were good and things that were not good, and not cover it up or say it didn't happen, or still carry on the prejudices of something, you know, a couple hundred years ago. Come on.
Books like yours are so important, you know, because it goes beyond the headlines. I mean, I think we're in a society that reads headlines too much. We need to dig deeper and see why and how, and we're also in a society that likes to erase history in a weird way, and not and not tell the truth too. I mean, it's where that's that, even with all the statues and the monuments, it's like, we need to tell the truth, people. You know, can we just we need to have like more plaques explaining. And I think it does actually really take books, because, and someone like you who can go, oh my gosh, okay, here's the lines and here's all the connections, and put it into something we can digest and get. So we appreciate that, you know.
And what I think would be really cool is if, you know, if you went in to, let's say, the northern entrance, and you were driving over to Mammoth and then around to the Lamar Valley, that maybe if you had your phone on and you had an app, it would pop up and it would tell you, it would just kind of give you little indicators of Indigenous history or, you know, other elements of the scientific exploration. And because what is so fascinating is that the two big loop roads in Yellowstone, which anyone who's ever been there is familiar with those roads, right? They are following Indigenous paths, original Indigenous paths. Because when Hayden got there, you know, he was saying, you know, we are the first to be here. We are breaking into a wilderness. Oh, but let's follow this trail, you know? So like, you're like, clearly people were here before.
Didn't he have Native Americans take him too? Didn't they help him track and learn?
No, he had he did not have Native guides. He had hired two guides from Bozeman, from Fort Ellis, one of whom was Hispano, and one of whom was Anglo. But he had no Native guides. They met with and kind of ran into Shoshone Bannock peoples, and then also Crow peoples, who were already removed to reservations on the northern side of the park and the southwestern side. So he was actually quite worried that they were going to run into the mountain Shoshone, who herded sheep in some of the mountain areas in what became the park. And that never came to pass, but he had a whole 2nd Cavalry detail with him to protect his group, just in case. So he was quite worried. He was worried about that, but it never came to pass.
Wow. So when you went there, obviously, did you spend time there? Did you keep going back? Tell us about your experience in the park.
I did. Yeah. So the first time I went to Yellowstone, I was 10 years old, and I went on one of those summer family trips. And we were on our way. I think we stopped at Yellowstone first, and then we went to Glacier, and then we went up into Canada, and then we came back down. That was our route for our 2 weeks. And then I did not go back until this past September. It was almost 40 years, which is wild to think about. But
that is.
Yeah. And because I was supposed to go, I started writing this book in the spring of 2019. And I was supposed to go to Yellowstone and to the National Park Archives in Gardner in May of 2020.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, we know how that goes.
yep. So that trip got canceled. I pushed it off to September. That one got canceled. So I actually wrote the entire book from my living room, just kind of transporting myself to Yellowstone in my imagination.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you watch a
yes.
lot of documentaries?
I did. Well, I mean, luckily I have, Yellowstone is such a well-documented place.
Yeah.
There were
Mhm.
so many photographs.
Yeah.
And the surveyor's diaries are actually quite detailed.
That's amazing.
But I mean, still, I'm an environmental historian, and so I love to be in the places that I write about.
Yeah.
Right.
And so it was actually a horrible experience not to be able to go
Mhm.
until
Yeah.
I was mostly done writing. But I was so happy to be able to go. And then I had all that research, and I was able, I just sort of acted as a de facto tour guide for my husband, and I was dragging him all over the place. Like,
Mhm.
I need to go see, because the Hayden Valley is named after Hayden, and I
Right.
was like, I want to know if they've got like a marker that explains who he was, and they do not.
Oh,
Wow.
they
And
don't.
it just says Hayden Valley. And
See,
Oh.
yeah,
yeah,
and
because
I was
Wow.
like, oh, he would be so
Dude,
mad. He would be.
I
Oh,
know. See, that's the
yeah.
thing when you do all this research,
Wow.
and I really agree with you. People, like, there are certain trails or whatever where, like, Apache Pass in
Yes.
Fort Bowie.
Yes.
That place is like when the wind just goes in this one
Mhm.
direction, you're like, ooh, you can feel like what happened, and there's something about that sense of place of what
Yes.
went down, and there's something about being there and understanding, like, what did it feel like? And dude, there's rattlesnakes in the middle of the war.
That's right.
It's like things like
Watch
that.
your
that are-
step. Yeah.
I know, right? And tarantulas too while we were there. But all these things are going on, and the environmental side is really important to understand what
Yes.
people went through. I mean, we just did an interview recording today talking about the Battle of New Orleans and the no man's land, neutral strip of Louisiana. And we were talking about, here it is, all these people like hiding out, like no one's messing with them for 3 years. They were forgotten about. Piece of
Yeah.
Louisiana. The Louisiana Purchase has gone through, but they're like, no one can tell us what to do. But they're hiding out. And I'm like, and then there's war, but there's gators in the middle.
Yeah, it's like
Yes.
there's how do you have a war?
Let's just float down this
Hide
river
out
in
with
the
the
middle of the night and
gators,
sneak on the, I'm like, the British came in, and I'm like, dude, these guys know gators. You don't. You're going
Yeah.
down, so the
Yeah.
environmental side and just the, that changed my life as a kid, like growing up and doing history, and then being able to be in the place where things went down, being in the grave sites. It really takes you, it just sobers you up.
Well, when you
and
come
understands.
across wildlife or something like the mud
Mm.
pots,
Yes.
that you're not, where else are you going to see that? The
Yeah.
mud pots. It's hard to imagine it if you've never actually seen it. I mean, yeah, you can
Exactly.
look at films, but you don't get the smell.
Exactly.
You don't get the
Exactly.
heat, you
And you don't get how big they are. Too.
Yeah.
And
so
how,
and it's weird.
yeah.
It's a weird thing. The mud pots, I still don't understand it. Why are you there? I don't get it. What's happening?
I know. There's such interesting features, and that's my
Yeah.
favorite part of the park, actually, that whole strip from Yellowstone Lake, where the river comes out, and then you go through that mud pot region, and then it dips down into the Hayden Valley, and all the bison are there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's such a beautiful place. And that, in fact, Hayden was really interested in that region too, the mud volcano region, and he actually fell in up to his knees into a mud pot, and it burned the boots off his legs.
Oh,
and he was able to drag himself out, pretty quickly. He was in pretty good shape from all of his field studies, so he was able to do that, but it destroyed his boots, and he said that, his legs were kind of scalded, and he was really uncomfortable for the rest of the trip. I know, and that was what was so wild about their accounts, is they were talking about how they were, they were either on horseback or they were walking, and they could hear the echo of their footsteps or the horse's steps, because the ground beneath them was hollow.
See, now that's scary right there.
Right?
Yeah,
I mean, that's why you stay on the paths. That's why when you're in Yellowstone,
you don't have all the Park Service signs going, do not do this.
Yeah.
They learned from, I want to ask the three-cornered war, you just a Pulitzer Prize finalist. This is amazing work.
Yes.
Where
yeah.
was that? Where did you go for the Southwest with that?
Oh, well, I went to Apache Pass.
Okay.
I basically every engagement site and every important site in New Mexico and Arizona, I went to, except for the battlefield of Valverde, which
Oh.
is in private hands. It's on ranch
Oh.
land of
Mhm.
none other than Ted Turner.
Oh
Ted
boy,
Turner
that's
has
a whole other.
huge, I know.
That's a whole other story. Don't
Oh,
start me.
boy.
Yeah. Yeah.
How in the
But-
world did that happen?
Don't
I
even
know.
start. Don't start
I
me on
know.
that.
I
Where
know.
That's just wrong.
That's a whole other.
It
That's
is.
a whole
That's
other
just
radio
It is.
show.
wrong.
We could
Yeah.
invite Ted Nugent on the same one.
Oh
No.
no, I know. Oh
I'm
my God.
just sorry. Oh, now I'm going to get in
Woo.
trouble. But
I know.
anyway, so you went with that. But did you do Fort Union and
Oh, yeah.
oh
Yep.
my gosh.
Fort Union and Glorieta. I was in
Oh, yeah,
Santa
yeah.
Fe and Albuquerque. I went over to
Mhm.
Bosque Redondo a couple of times,
Yeah.
Fort Sumner, and
Cool.
then went down to Mesilla and then did Apache Pass. And that was actually, Apache Pass was amazing. And this is what I tell, when I talk about that book, this is what I tell people. You know, a lot of Civil War historians kind of discount this theater as not being particularly important and not having anything to say. That is wrong, by the way.
It's wrong, yeah.
So I argue with them about that. And then I'm like, if you are a Civil War buff who loves going to Civil War sites, they still exist all
Mhm.
over New Mexico and Arizona because they're kind of out there. They haven't been developed. They are saved by kind of mishmash. Some are state sites, some are BLM, some are National Historic Sites. But they're there. They're actually there. And you can go visit them. Unlike, you know, some places in Virginia, there's like a mini mall, you know, where the
that
historic
sucks.
site should be, you know.
Yeah. that
So
sucks.
so I was actually able to go, but Apache Pass was hilarious because I had heard that the one approach was really hard on car tires and that because it's very rocky, and I didn't want to bust a tire in my car, you know, there. And so I went the other way, which involved driving through a dry arroyo to get to the hiking path that took me to
The
Apache
1.5
Pass.
hour hiking path.
Yes.
Yeah, the park ranger, I have to send you a link to that. We did a video with the park ranger who's now, she was at the Fort Bowie, now she's at Fort Churchill in Nevada, Pony
Oh.
Express history. And that whole thing, talking about the Native Americans and, oh, we better set up a fort because there's Indians out there. My God. So, but it's interesting how all that, like the railroad, all of that, but she took us out there and she's like, people will drive up and park and take that walk to the visitor center in their flip-flops, not realizing, like they say, you're in the Sonoran Desert. I mean, you are
Anything
in the
could
heart
happen.
of rattlesnake country,
Yep.
all of it, but it's fascinating out there. I mean, it's neat because the Butterfield stage route's there, and you just go when you see the actual pass and where they took Geronimo.
And
Geronimo's
it's so, yeah, it's so cool. And it's so beautiful. And again, like not developed. So you've got that whole path. Apache Spring is still there.
Yep.
You've got the 1862 ruins of the first fort. And then you've got the newer fort ruins, the adobe ruins. And it is a phenomenal site. I love that site.
Sometimes I wish in some of these parks and historic sites that we could have holograms from history. Like, you know,
oh, wouldn't that be cool?
Wouldn't it be cool because you have the real people and the real scenery and somehow bring them back?
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, I know that there are some initiatives. Yeah, there are some initiatives to that historians are working on to do kind of virtual reality programming that's a little bit like that. So you would hold your phone up and you might see what it looked like in that, you know, at a certain point in time.
They're doing that in Springfield,
Illinois.
Illinois.
Yeah.
Springfield, Illinois. I think it's at Abraham Lincoln's presidential library. They're doing that. You can hear voices of when everybody was putting them down to run, and so it's kind of an interactive thing. One of the travel writers in the magazine was talking about that she said she just didn't realize how they were just nailing him and just talking down about him, you know. But I'm so glad you went to Apache Pass. There's so few people we know that
I know. When you said Apache Pass, I was like,
dude, I know. And it's like, well, and it's the California column history that everybody's got to learn. The California column and the Bascom Affair. It's like, it's some crazy history,
amazing.
But
it really
I'm
is.
so glad it led you up to Yellowstone.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
It's all connected. It's all connected.
Exactly.
Well, good luck with saving Yellowstone. I hope,
Thank
you
you.
know, Pulitzer Prize maybe this time, you know, finalist is really
I
pretty.
mean, who knows? It
Go
was.
get it.
That's still very surreal. Still very
No,
Yeah.
but that's awesome. That's so
No, that
cool.
is awesome.
Yeah.
Congratulations on that.
Yes.
And
Thank you.
so everyone, MeganKateNelson.com is the website, and get it everywhere you can get books. And is it on
Yep.
bookshop.org too? Because people can support their local books.
Yes, and
Great.
IndieBound. Yes,
Cool,
and
cool.
it's in all different formats too. So if you want to read it in hardcover, you could do that, or ebook, or audiobook. if you
Awesome.
wanna
I'm glad it's
listen to it.
audio.
Yeah.
Yes, we
Ooh.
need that as we drive
Yeah.
across the country
I know.
in our little
Oh,
wagon.
it's so great. I love this project of yours. It's fantastic.
It's fun. It's
Yeah.
fun. Oh, I got to give a shout out to our sponsor of today's show, the National Parks Arts Foundation. Speaking of Fort Union, one of their artist residencies is in Fort Union, where anybody who is on the creative arts, writers, poets,
should-
musicians, filmmakers,
Yeah.
photographers, painters, you apply to spend a month in a national park unit, from Hawaii volcanoes to Fort Union, Chaco Canyon. You've got to have gone through there a little bit, and
Mm.
on
Yeah.
your drives, and Dry Tortugas, your own private island for a month. And
That sounds good.
it's just not so hard. So anyway, nationalparksartsfoundation.org is the website to go check out and catch our first Friday shows with them. So thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. This was really wonderful.
Cool.
Take
Thank
care.
you.